This is the Rurouni philosopher, where I take a look at martial arts and in martial arts and pop culture and examine them from a philosophical point of view. I'm willing to bet that when you hear the word honor mentioned, your thoughts will immediately go to images of samurai with katanas and committing seppuku, or perhaps knights from the Middle Ages of Europe, or perhaps, if you're more broad-minded, the wars and battles in the Middle East and Africa around the time of the rise of Islam. Whatever your vision is, the idea is generally the same. Old school warriors fighting and or living by some form of strict code of conduct or morality. As a consequence of this idea, I'm also willing to bet that you will have a more subtle follow-up about honor being essentially an outmoded idea as well, being out of touch with the modern world and the true nature of combat. While I believe there is truth in the concepts of honor, I also believe that there are some misconceptions as well. Hell, if I'm being completely honest, I don't think anyone has a real idea of what honor truly means. And I think that is because it's a nebulous concept to begin with, that is dependent on so many extenuating factors that two groups can believe in a concept of honor while at the same time having a completely opposite view of how it works. I'm going to start out with one of the oldest ideas of honor that is at the same time common throughout all variations of its practitioners. That is, its association with war, and all things combat related. Going back to the first documented conflicts, war has always had an element of how others perceive it. Even if, as they say, the victors write the history, why are they writing history at all? What does it matter how other people outside your community or your descendants think of them, what they did, or why they did it? In battles in the animal kingdom, after all, they don't consider such things, and they're just as brutal as human combat. But as far as we can tell, they don't worry about how the perception of the outcome is. They won, got the territory, got the prey, got the mate, and that's pretty much all that matters. Only humans seem to have such concerns. So it would be easy to conclude that higher level perception of one's existence is a necessity. The more advanced civilization seems to become, the more the need to create stories around why the fight took place. We can see this in the legendary tales from Homer and the old myths across the world. It is even written or carved into the very surroundings, going so far as to engrave massive monuments that at least in part celebrate that conflict. Rationalizing our actions is a step towards, but comes next to, codification, meaning that a certain level of systematic thinking is created around the violence. This, practically speaking, results in not acting on violence out of instinct, though high emotions can still cause a fight. Rather, it's that these actions are intertwined with rationale and a higher level of thought, rather than just fighting on pure instinct, or for that alone. Human civilizations are developed by geography, environment, culture, and interactions with other civilizations, and honor is a part of that culture as well, so it's influenced by those same factors. Much of what we think of as honor today in the West has been shaped by Judeo-Christian values: fighting with a good reason, avoiding all-out war if it can be helped, no torture and raping of civvies or captives, though how often was that actually applied, and so on. Obviously, these have not all been obeyed, but the values still exist none the same. This is the main reason why a former soldier who I spoke to made this statement to me about honor being on the battlefield. He said basically that when it comes to honor, it is for ceremonies and when the war is over and before the war starts. But when battle actually begins, it has no place. As his and other vets like his experience goes, those values and ideals, good as they might be, often either don't apply or can't be relied on to win a war. However, rooted in experience and actual practice as that view might be, it too, I think, is also flawed. And this is because many of the societies that made claims to having honor codes were just as brutal, if not more so, on the battlefield as off the battlefield, and yet can still considered it honorable. Let's take, for example, two of Ultimate Warrior icons that are often paired opposite of each other: the Samurai and the Vikings. When it comes to systematic code of conduct, the Samurai are the poster boys of that ideal. Much of this view has been developed over the last 77 years in the West. this being propagated by the spread of Japanese martial arts like karate via US veterans coming back from the Pacific War and the US's temporary control of post-war Japan. Facts, myths, and ideas mixed together in the Western mind like kamikaze pilots' suicidal loyalty to their emperor, samurai being noble and loyal warriors, and eventually the idea that modern Japanese martial arts are developed and taught as a way of developing discipline and self-control rather than killing or maiming of actual combat. That, despite being a fact that many other Asian communities did not hold that view, or at the very least had a more nuanced view of it. This is because the reality being that the samurai honor was never about good behavior on the battlefield. Samurai nobles looked down on peasants and treated them that way when they felt like it. Rape and total massacre was just as common an occurrence throughout Japanese history as other places. Equally though, a code of conduct did still exist as well, hence our familiarity with ideas of seppuku or harakiri, the early samurai's preference for the bow and arrow, and the later idea of the drawing of the sword demanding a life be taken if it is drawn. Yet even within these honorable codas, there was still brutality. The Northmen, on the other hand, for centuries were seen from the get-go as having no honor or civilization whatsoever. And there was good reason for this, as much of this view had been told by their victims and their enemies, the people themselves leaving very little actual documentation of their side of the story. To hear the term Viking is to conjure the image of a large Caucasian bearded warrior wielding a crazy helmet and beating their rounded shields or wielding large battle axes, raping and pillaging as they sailed up and down rivers. The best known example of this is the berserker, which, like the kamikaze, we get the meaning of the modern term. And these were also largely true. There are sources besides those of their enemies that document just how brutal their society could be. One coming from an Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who recorded a ritual of a chieftain that involved the group rape of one of his sex slaves captured during a raid before being stabbed to death by the chieftain's wives during his funeral. And by the way, yes, women could be just as complicit in these brutal acts as other men could. So there you are. However, these were not the only facets to Norse culture. They did in fact have their own honor code as well, known as the 9 Noble Virtues: courage, truth, honor, fidelity, discipline, hospitality, self-reliance, industriousness, and perseverance. The same rules about cultural concepts of honor apply here as they do anywhere else, and that how these values were defined by the Norsemen may not be how we define them today. Beyond that, the Norsemen, despite their violence, did also have their own culture and founded many civilizations, while influencing many others. All this being said, the bottom line was this, that if a civilization existed, it had fighting. And if it had fighting, it had a coda for how they saw fighting and when and why it should be done. But that's all historical, and for many modern combat enthusiasts, it's not very practical, at least not on the surface. The real question for them is, does honor even exist now, or should it? Some see it like religion, a relic of the past that should be left there for more progressive and more practical values. In the face of modern street fighting, self-defense, and assault, one would not be faulted for holding such a view. After all, for most people, the results trump the integrity. Even more modern fighting styles like MMA will sometimes low-key criticize modern views of honor for the impracticality, leaving openings and whatnot. Hell, even Musashi Miyamoto, Japan's and arguably the world's greatest swordsman, was critical of the tight structure that honor codes left their practitioners in, even though he also did believe in some concept of it as well. I think the answer to these questions is yes, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The first being that, going back to historical context, humans feel a need to have their violence be above just primal animal behavior. Even if that comes out in the midst of all the fighting, breaking loose in war, or fighting for your life in a gang fight, the primal side subsides and is dressed up afterwards. We don't just continue going around caving in people's heads after we killed our enemies. Even the Mongols, perhaps the most violent and brutal human society to have ever existed in human history, had a cap to their violence. Humans don't want to think of themselves as wild animals, and I think they're incapable of behaving like total wild animals because of our capacity for higher thought. The second reason is related to the first. I think that thinking of actions as honorable on some level makes us feel good about ourselves and who we are. What I mean is that there's almost a quasi-spiritual element to it, that our actions extend beyond us somehow. Even in something as self-centered as the ancient Greek and modern cage fighting idea of attaining immortal glory for ourselves. The idea is still immortal, so it's still something that passes beyond us. Honor is an intangible element that raises us above basic human existence. I think that's why so many martial arts cultures have been on the rise in the last decade. Look at the show Vikings, for example. Yes, it's largely off historically and takes a number of liberties with the actual events that happened over a millennia ago. But the parts of it that are true, and even some parts that are not, resonate with a lot of their viewers. And even in modern society, they represent. I've seen a lot of women sporting the Viking hairstyle that the warrior queen character Lagertha wears, as well as more exploration into Norse martial arts, or at least what we can derive of it anyway, as well as pride in the more positive aspects of that ancient culture. It's a repeat of the same cycle that happened with karate, kung fu, and silat. A mixture of fact and fiction that not only generates curiosity about the cultures they represent, but that for many on some level brings extra meaning into the people of that culture's lives. However, despite these elements, one view of honor that should always be at the forefront, and I think is slowly becoming more well known, is that acting honorably does not mean not acting brutally. And perhaps this is what our modern definitions of honor should be. That essentially, within this context, honor is about the commitment to action when the time requires it. Fight as hard as you need to when the fight is on and to the best of your ability. And if it's self-defense, without any civilized rules because your life is now on the line. In the ancient world, that seems to be the most common aspect to the view of honor. That it wasn't about nice behavior, but that total commitment to a cause or to defeating an enemy. And if you were totally committed, then essentially you were behaving honorably, no matter how reprehensible we might view it today. So therefore, I think that if we are going to come to some sort of consensus as to what honor actually is, when put in the light of context of history and actual practice, that we must first let go of the Judeo-Christian concepts that we currently have of it. That it's about nice behavior, gentleman fighting, and the like. But rather, it's the face of empowerment, self-evolving of a person's abilities and sustaining those abilities, while at the same time being ruthlessly ugly and also frightening as well.